Normally, in our church services, we will have somebody get up and do a communion meditation. A lot of times it happens right here before the sermon. But for the next 4 weeks, the sermon kind of is the communion meditation. And we're going to take just a minute to think about what this is and what it's about. And so if you've not picked up, if you're new to the church and you've not been here before, we have some communion there in the back. It's in a little prepackaged kind of a thing like that. And if you want to top back there and get that before the end of the sermon, you'll need it there at the very end. Jesus, we believe, started communion himself. He's eating supper, the Last Supper, with his disciples, and he kind of changes it. Now, the reason they were together, the disciples and Jesus, there on that last moment, was to celebrate the Passover. Jews got together for thousands of years to remember that night when Moses set the Israelites free from Egypt, and the angel passed over the land, and it spared anybody covered by the blood of the Lamb, and it was a night to remember Israel's independence. It would have the same sort of resonance as July 4th does for Americans, but more, because it wasn't just about Independence Day. It was that, but it wasn't just that. It was about how God had chosen them. That nation of slaves out of all the different nations of the world, and that God said, you guys are going to be my guys. You're going to be the ones who are going to make a difference for me, a kingdom of priests. And so Jews got together every year to remember that moment when that happened, and they still celebrate it. Passover still gets celebrated amongst Jewish communities today. And Jesus was sitting there to eat with the disciples for that moment, for that Passover feast that they always got together for. And he says to them while they're there that night, took some bread, and he gave thanks for it, and he said, "This is my body, which is for you, and I want you to do this in remembrance of me." Now, today, this passage is a very familiar passage. If you're a Christian, if you've been in church very long, it's a passage you've heard. It doesn't seem weird at all that Jesus would say that. But in that moment, it had to have struck those guys as a little strange, because they're not there, strictly speaking, to think about Jesus. They're there to think about God freeing the slaves. And Jesus takes that moment and he makes it about himself. And if the things that happened over the next couple of days didn't happen to Jesus, I think it would have been dismissed as somebody who was crazy. It would be like at a 4th of July celebration. Seeing those fireworks there, that's all for me. I mean, it would be a weird thing to say. It'd be a strange thing to toss out there. But Jesus does that, and he's kind of taken that celebration, that Passover celebration, and he's changing it. So you're never going to look at this the same way. You're not going to think about this moment the same way. This bread, he says, this is my body. And he took bread, and he takes us, and that bread represents his body, and the body of Christ is the church, and we're the church, and he takes us, and he says, "You're mine, and I'm yours, and I want you to remember this." And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, and he said, "This cup is a new covenant in my blood, and whenever you drink this, I want you to think about me. I want you to remember this. I want you to pause just for a moment and think back about how this all started." And again, just a crazy, weird thing to say if the things that happened over the next couple of days hadn't happened. But of course, those things did happen. Jesus was crucified, and then he resurrected. And those disciples looked back at all this and felt different about it. They remembered this as kind of being the kickoff of a new kingdom when God chose them, out of all the different nations to be his. In really the same way that the Passover represented that, well, now Jesus represents that. And he takes us and he makes us free from the sins that can wreck us, and from hell that wants to take us down. We're no longer held by that. And the same God who set the Israelites free from Egypt thousands of years ago sets us free today, and we hold on to Christ. And it's just bread and wine. I mean, in that day, it was part of every meal. And it's possible, in fact, when Jesus, when he says these things, whenever you eat the bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death. It's possible that he's saying not just at Passover, but every time you eat. I want you to take a minute to remember this. I think that might have kind of been the implication. Every time you get together and eat, bread and wine were such a common thing. Two of Jesus' miracles. He makes more bread and he makes more wine. It was kind of a staple for their diet. And he's there to provide that, right? And he's there to make that possible for all of them. And he wants them to remember this. Whenever you get together, he says, I want you to think about it. The body of Christ, his bread, that when we eat that bread, we remember that there is a body of Christ and we're part of it. And that wine, that juice, when we drink that juice, when we think about that, it's like his blood is covering us. The same way the blood covered him at Passover, that blood now covers us. And Jesus laid down his life and he shed his blood, and now I can stand up. And every time I take it, I think about him. I think about what he did. And in Christian churches, like Mount Pleasant Christian Church, we do that every week. Some churches don't. They'll do it every quarter maybe, or every month, or maybe once a year, or once every 2 or 3 years. There's a lot of different freedom, I think, in this. But the command that Jesus gave was to do it frequently, and so we try to do it frequently. In fact, we're not against it happening more than that. I know sometimes the youth group on a retreat might take communion, while they're on the retreat on a Friday or Saturday or whenever they're out. I know sometimes a small group might do that. If they're studying this, it might be a Tuesday or Wednesday evening, and they'll stop and just take a minute to remember. And I don't know why exactly he picked the way he did for us to do that, but that's what he did. And we're going to spend just a few weeks thinking about that and different aspects of it. And what I wanted to do this first week is to think about this aspect that he chose you for it. That he took bread, but he takes us, and now we're part of that. And there's a verse at the Last Supper in John. There's a verse, and Jesus, he's talking to the disciples, and he says, "You didn't choose me, so I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit that'll last. You didn't choose me," he says. And there's debates about that with Christians. Some Christians feel like you never really choose God, that God alone decides who gets saved and who doesn't, and he so overwhelms you with his body and his spirit and his power that when you respond, you can't help it. Other churches take more of the attitude that God whispers to everybody and tries to win everybody back, and in that moment when God seems so very close, you have a chance to respond, and then we did respond, and we took him up on that offer. But it always starts with him. Whichever way you take to look at that thing, there's no question that we only love him because he first loved us. And the disciples, again, this quote here is said during the Last Supper. They would probably remember when he says that. "Oh, I remember when you called me. I remember that. I remember when what I was doing." Now, 5 of the disciples, there's 12 disciples, at least 5, maybe all of them, we don't know for sure, doesn't mention all of them, but at least 5 of them were called to follow Jesus while they were at work. I think that's interesting. I know attitudes towards work are different in our generation than they would have been then, and how Americans feel about work would be a little different than how Israelis in the first century. But it was mostly the same. People haven't evolved that much, and it would be a big deal for most of you at work to tell the boss, "I'm done. I just met this Jesus, and I'm going to go his direction, and I'm done." And just to walk away from your job. That's what Peter and Andrew did. They were fishermen, and he called, and they left. James and John, it says they were working with their dad, and Jesus called, and they left. I grew up on a farm, and if my brother and I were working with Dad on something out in the farm, and Jesus called, and I just walked away from Dad, I'd better be sure it was going to get me to heaven, because he would never get over it. He'd have been mad about that for months and months if I just walked out during the middle of the day. And I think a lot of work is like that. You think about how big a deal it'd be for you in the middle of work to be so inspired by something that you just, I can't waste another minute here. You know, there's a Johnny Paycheck song a long time ago. You take this job and shove it, and you might have fantasies about doing that, you know, leaving in a fit of anger. But it's not a fit of anger. You know, you're working, you're just doing your thing. You're trying to make a living for your family, and then Jesus appears, and suddenly this is the most important thing in the world. And they just walked away with him. Matthew, he's got a special job. He's collecting taxes for the Roman Empire. It was, even though it would make you kind of a dirty person in the eyes of your fellow citizens, it was a wealthy position. And there were lots of people who wanted it, even though it was so dirty. And Matthew probably was rich. And what I find about people who have a little bit of money is what they're mostly concerned about is having a little bit more and making sure they have plenty of money stashed away. And yet, Matthew gets called. You're my guy. Come follow me. And he just leaves work. He just walks away. And so many of the guys had experiences like that with Jesus. They're just going about their day. There's this weird conversation in John chapter 1. He meets a guy named Nathaniel, which is probably the same. There's two different lists of disciples. Nathaniel and Bartholomew are probably the same guy. They different lists of the disciples list different names, but Nathaniel's not an important disciple. He's not a guy we hear much about after he meets with Jesus. But Jesus sees him, and when he first sees him, he says, "Oh, here's a real honest Israelite, man. Here's somebody who doesn't tell a lie." And Nathaniel answers back to Jesus, "You know me?" And he says, "I saw you sitting under the tree." And we don't know exactly what it was he saw him doing. I mean, we don't know exactly what it was but that triggers something. Like Nathaniel's like, "You're God. You're like he realizes it's such a weird conversation. It never really explains it in the Bible. He sees him there, and Jesus says, "I saw you. I've always seen you." And it just so rattles Nathaniel. And again, this verse behind me, "You didn't choose me, Nathaniel. I chose you. I chose you, Peter. I chose Peter." That's an interesting thing. In John's telling of it, and when John tells about that, his name's Simon. And he sees Simon and immediately says, "You're not Simon anymore. He calls him Cephas, which is the Hebrew form of the Greek Peter, which means rock. And it always gets translated Peter in the Bible. And something's kind of lost there. I mean, if we called him Rock, you might see it like Dwayne Johnson, but you would see him different, right? You'd like, you're not Simon, you're the Rock. And he calls him Rock after that. You're the Rock. I mean, that's who you are. And like he sees something in Peter that Peter probably doesn't even see in himself. And he says, "I'm going to make you something. And you didn't choose me. You didn't come to me for some self-improvement thing. I saw you. I had all this planned for you. You're going to be something. And right now you're just some dude, but I'm going to make." And Peter's at work. And he just can't stay at work anymore. Now Jesus, at some level, calls you, just like he called them. We don't have Jesus here physically with us where I can grab a hold of his arm, but he still calls people. And the Bible's real clear about that. A couple different verses. He says, he chose us, Ephesians chapter 1. He chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption. He chose. We sang that song just a second ago. We are chosen, not forsaken. And he grabbed us. And he's just like Nathaniel. He has always seen you. God has always been aware of you. And I want to say something to you, especially if you've not made a big decision about God. I'm convinced that people at some level, even before they make that decision, because I was, you're vaguely aware that you're not alone here in the world, that there's something going on. There's some sort of a song in the background that you almost can hear, but not quite. And it's God, and there's a plan. And sometimes when the heaven and earth just almost touch, I mean, you can feel that. And God's always seen you. And God's always whispering to you, asking you to come back closer to Him. Excuse me a second. I picked this up from my wife, and I'm blaming her for it. She had it first. Anyway, that's first verse. Second verse, same kind of idea. Being confident of this, Philippians 1:6, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to the day of completion in Christ Jesus. This is a good memory verse because it's the same verse with Peter there. He sees Simon, says, "You're Simon, but you're not just Simon, you're a rock. I'm going to make you a rock." And he sees us, and he calls something out over us. I'm going to make you more than you are. And the God who started this thing is not going to stop until it's over. He's just not going to quit. And we can count on him to do it. Now, in the Bible, this happens several different times. And the most common reaction that we read about is people don't totally believe it. He tells Moses that, "I'm going to make something out of you, Moses." And Moses says, "Please find someone else." He tells Jeremiah, "You're my guy. Before you were even born, I knew you in the womb, and I was preparing you for something, and you're my guy." And Jeremiah tries over and over and over again to quit. "I'm just not sure, God." And again, the issue is not that they don't believe in God. I mean, they believe in both cases, they're talking to God. I mean, they're having conversations with God in a way that we don't normally. I mean, it's very vivid. So they believe in God, but they just don't believe that God's going to come through all the way. And I think it reflects not so much a doubt in God, but you know yourself. And you know how many different times that you've went on a new commitment to get better, some new growth exercise or new promise you made. "I'll never do that again. Give me a second chance." And you know you. I believe in God, but I know me, and it's hard to believe that I'm going to get there. There's this weird story with, I think it's a weird story, where Paul, he's going to Damascus, and he sees the light, and he's blind. And they take him into Damascus, and he's not converted yet, but it just completely crushes him. And he sees God in the vision, and he's going to become the great champion of the church. But nobody knows that at the moment. At the moment, he's just this guy who God has afflicted. And God speaks audibly to this other dude in the town, a guy named Ananias. He says, "I want you to go to Paul, and I want you to baptize him." And Ananias says, "Have you heard of this guy, God?" And it's such a weird story. I'd like to think about myself that if I ever heard an audible voice from God, that would solve all my faith problems. If I was praying and, "God, please just answer me," and God says, "Okay," and answered me, and I could hear it, and it was vivid, and there was no question, right? I mean, it was an obvious statement from, like the heavens open and God speaks, right? What a faith boost that would be for me. But it's not for Ananias. It's not for him. And God speaks, and Ananias says, "I want you to go do this." And Ananias says, "I don't know, God." And it's just such a weird conversation. Because Ananias says, "God, I believe in you, and I believe you can do miracles. But this guy, I don't know." It's such a weird thing. But again, I think we know people, don't we? And it's hard to believe sometimes that some people are going to change. But God has this vision of it. And he sees it, and the God who starts it is going to finish it. And the God who got you started is going to finish it. And you didn't choose God. Not at least before he chose you. I've always been kind of fascinated by team building. With the college basketball stuff that's going on right now, teams will spend money to get guys to transfer to their schools. They'll go on recruiting trips and meet moms and dads in living rooms and try to talk kids into coming to their school. And it's all with this idea that if you can get just the right mix of kids, just the right mix of talent on your team, it's magic. And every year, every college team thinks their guy's done it. And it usually doesn't work out. Usually the one you brought in doesn't turn out like you think he's going to, or the team doesn't totally gel. something goes wrong. But it's not just that. I mean, the Beatles are fascinating, and John and Paul had such talent for writing, and George comes on, and nobody knows how gifted he is, but he becomes such a big deal. I don't know what Ringo did, but they all contribute something, And when they all get together and they're all doing their thing, it's powerful. And it doesn't always work out. There's lots of bands that start and never go anywhere, but every once in a while, just the right combination of people come together, and it changes things. There was a book a long time ago, they made a movie out of it with Seabiscuit, and just such a fantastic book. And it's all about this team building. And the main character in it's a guy named Charles Howard, and he's a car dealer. And this is the early days of car dealers. And he's such a good car dealer, and he's such a good negotiator that GM basically gives him control of every dealership west of the Mississippi. Because in 1910 or 20, there was nobody living out there. You can have all of them, they said. Well, it turned out to be a pretty lucrative investment for Charles Howard. And he advertised that his big slogan is, "I'm here to put the horse out of business." That was his advertising slogan. And but his son died young, and it broke him, and it broke his marriage, and it sunk him into a spiral. And kind of as a hobby, just to kind of get his mind off of stuff, he started investing in horses, horse racing. And he tried to get a guy to come be his trainer, and he had a hard time getting one of the really good ones to do it. Nobody wanted to take a chance on this owner that nobody knew. And he finally found this guy, Tom Smith, and he was so good with horses, but he was so bad with people that nobody would hire him. And in fact, when he died, he was the most famous horse trainer in the country, and nobody came to the funeral. Just terrible with people. They had a jockey in mind, a guy named Red Pollard, and he was too heavy to be a jockey. He was too light to be a boxer and too heavy to be a jockey, and he was blind in one eye. And he was combative, and nobody would hire him. And they settled on Seabiscuit to be the horse they were going to buy. And Seabiscuit had lost his first 17 races. And they mixed all four of those together, and it was magic. They just owned the sport for about 10 years. They just couldn't lose. You had the owner putting the horse out of business, and the trainer that nobody liked, and the jockey who's too heavy, and the horse that can't win. But when they're together, it's powerful. And I think God puts together his body the way he wants it put together. I think he selects each part just like he wants it. And he chose you. Could have chose anybody, but he chose you. And here you are. And it may be hard to know for sure what parts you have in this thing. And maybe all you can see is what you're not contributing yet. But you can rest confident in this, that the God who started this work in you is going to carry it through to completion. He's got a plan. And he's got a plan to make some sort of a difference with us in this world. Back to that verse earlier. You didn't choose me, I chose you. So you're chosen. And I have a plan that you're going to go and bear fruit. You're going to make some sort of a difference in this world. That's what bear fruit means. You're going to go out. This conversation in John 15 is all part of conversation from a teaching he does about how I'm the vine and you're the branches. And within that context of vine and branches, he says, you're going to bear fruit. You're going to be connected to me, I'm the vine, and you're going to produce. I promise. I think at some level he's talking about evangelism. I think at some level he's talking about your character's going to change. You're going to change mentally. You're going to become a different sort of person. You're going to start seeing more evidence of God. And as you see more evidence of God, you're going to jump deeper and deeper into this thing. When you think back about your life and you think about all the different ways that God has moved, it's going to push you forward. And he's not going to quit on you. When you come into this place, you have all the tools you need. You just need him to work with it. When we were in California last week, one of the families that we're doing, just as a family exercise, we're doing this personality test. They were all going to see what everybody's personality was. And I always think that stuff's interesting, too. I like all the little gift tests you do, and I do all the tests. I can't remember what I am on the Johnson Myers-Briggs or whatever thing. I'm a introvert and intuitive, I think, and a feeler, and I forget what the other one was. But I'm in that. I'm an 8-wing 9 on that Enneagram, and I hate the Enneagram. I'll tell people sometimes that because when you tell somebody who really loves that, they think they got you all figured out, and I'll say I'm an 8-wing 9. They'll say, yeah, I knew that, and that just ticks me off when they say it, like you know, you don't know anything about me. That's what makes me mad. And I told one person who was real serious about it. I said I'm an 8-wing 9. Oh yeah, I knew that. Oh, but how do you know? You don't know anything about me. It just ticks me off when people say that kind of stuff. And they said that's exactly what an 8-wing 9 would say. Then they said checkmate, and I was done. I do all those little tests. There's a disc profile. I'm a heavy D, light C, if you've done that one. There's lots of spiritual gifts tests you can do. On the spiritual gifts test, I'm always high on discernment and teaching. Those are always my two big ones. There was even a test on BuzzFeed, the which Disney princess are you? And I did that one. You want to guess? Mulan. I was Mulan. Yeah. You knew it. You heard me. You've heard me before. It's not obvious I'm Mulan. Oh, typical. I knew you were Mulan. Is that what you're saying? I could see that right off. You're not fooling me. Have Mulan written all over you. And the cool part about those kinds of tests, the cool part about those kinds of exams is I get to study me. I love to study me. I love to think harder about me and think about how I'm wired and what I'm about. And all those things give me more insight into me, and I just can't get enough insight into me. And I understand why people love to do those things. They're very popular. People get into it. And I think about all the different gifts that I have. But God can see all that at a level that I can't see. He sees my strengths and my weaknesses. He even sees my pain. And God can do great things with my pain if I let him. I could speak into the life of somebody else dealing with the same pain that I have, and I can help them in a way that nobody else can help them. I can make a difference there if I'm brave enough to trust him. And sometimes, like Ananias or Jeremiah or Moses or probably Peter, I have doubt that God's going to come through. But he will. He chose me. He chose you so that you could go out and bear fruit and make some sort of a difference in this world. Which brings me back all the way to communion. All that is foundation for this communion thing. When that night when he was serving them the bread and the wine and making it all about himself, they were filled with all those thoughts. They didn't understand totally what Jesus was doing. They didn't understand totally what Jesus was saying. They knew he was different. They knew he was worth following. But they didn't have all the answers. They knew how they were. Nervous and envious. Self-important. On the night that he told them all this stuff, they argued about which one of them was the greatest. They had a hard time settling for what he might want to do. But Jesus knew what they could become if they would stay with him. Let me say that again, because that's where I wanted to get to the whole sermon. Jesus knew what they could become if they would stay with him. He knows what you can become if you'll stay with him. I'm going to have the band come back up, if they don't mind, if they're in here. And I want to think about that with you guys. Now, a lot of times we'll have you stand right up here. I don't want to do that. Just stay seated just for a minute. And I want you to try to put yourself, if you can, back in that moment, right? Back in that setting with Jesus. And he's passing out the bread. He's passing out the wine. And he's telling them, I chose you. And he's asking you to stick with him, to see what you can become. Now, communion, of course, is about lots of things, but it's about this. It's about that second commitment again, you know? that when I take this, I'm agreeing again to go a little further. It's a long race. My lungs are burning, and I might want to quit. Sometimes when I think about the whole length of the race, it's too much to imagine. But when I take communion, I'm committing to go a little further. So let's just take a minute to pray. And you pray where you're at and stay seated. And then at the end of praying here together, we're going to take communion together. So let's pray. God in heaven, you see my heart. You see all my insecurities and my doubts. My sin's not hidden from you. You can see, God, where I struggle. And yet you chose me. I can look around this room and see lots of people who I don't measure up against. People smarter than me, or more talented, or more prosperous, or more successful. People who have better ideas. And I can wonder, God, when I do that, why you'd ever choose me. But you did. But you did. So God, as we commit here again in communion, and we think again about you, we think, God, again about what you did and who you are. Give us the strength to go a little further and to rest, God, in your love and your care for us. In Christ's name, amen.